Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the start of the spring semester. I'm sure you're all as excited about that as I am. So I wanted to welcome you as the Dean of the Law School on behalf not only of the Law School, but of the Law School's Diversity Committee. The committee has put together today's events, and they have a series of events that will be happening this spring, and you'll hear a little bit more about that towards the end of our conversation today. The Diversity Committee's mission is to foster a welcoming environment for future lawyers from all backgrounds and to ensure that all of our graduates are equipped to effectively serve diverse clients and communities. And in today's conversation, our goal is to bring together members of all the law school's different constituencies for the first of many conversations which will explore the connections between issues of race, law, and justice. And we would, of course, ask that is at all law school events, you follow the law school's rules of decorum. Painful experience now has forced me to add that to all of these announcements. And perhaps my biggest contribution to today's program is to ask you to please turn off your cell phones if you haven't already. So we think it's particularly fitting that these discussions should honor Dr. Martin Luther King. But really, to celebrate King's legacy and his work, we have to go beyond the static image of the person we see in our history textbooks. We have to think of him as more than a distant and iconic figure who, along with Washington and Lincoln, has been courteous enough to give us all that extra day off. Much as we appreciate that, we need to think a little bit more and to explore King's influence on us as a society and as individuals. In recent events here in Minneapolis and around the country make the need for that exploration all too apparent. Police shootings in places like Ferguson, Baltimore, and Minneapolis, the murder of 9 innocent people who were attending services in South Carolina, the surge of anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant rhetoric that all of us have heard so prominently in recent months, continuing inequities in housing, jobs, education, and so many other fields, and the protests that all of these have engendered make this an important issue for us to address here at the law school. Of course, we work and we study in a building that is named for someone who is famous for promoting civil rights. I trust I don't need to say who that is, but just in case, I happened to actually speak to Mr. Mondale this morning on something else. But he is someone who would be the first to tell you that despite the incredible progress that has been made since he started working on these issues 50 or 60 years ago, he would be the first to say we still have a very long way to go. Now, in preparation for today's discussion, we've invited our very distinguished panelists to start by taking us back 50-some years to a pivotal moment in the history of civil rights, to 1963, and in particular to Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to do so. It's really remarkable how much that letter resonates today, how much the issues that Dr. King addressed are still being debated and discussed. At the time he had to write that letter, he didn't have a laptop, of course. He had to write it on scraps of paper that were made available to him in his jail cell. And he was in jail because he refused to obey a court order. There was an injunction from a circuit court judge against parading, demonstrating, boycotting, trespassing, and picketing. But the letter in particular is a response to an article that appeared in a newspaper. It was a joint statement by 8 white Alabama clergymen who were criticizing King's strategy of nonviolent protest. Not that they were asking for violent protest, but they felt that the fight for civil rights should be done exclusively in the courts, that outsiders, such as they considered Dr. King, should let Birmingham residents resolve matters themselves, that the timing, in their view, wasn't right for protests, that the protesters were extremists, and that the demonstrations were illegal. He wanted to respond. Even though his practice was not to respond to that sort of thing, he felt he needed to respond, and that was the genesis of his letter. And the response is justly famous. In response to the charge that he was an outsider, Dr. King said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And then he added that whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And then he went on to address each of the other criticisms of his approach. Perhaps most pertinent for us as lawyers is his argument that civil disobedience is appropriate and necessary in the face of unjust laws, and that's something we'll have a chance to consider today. So his letter sets the stage for our discussion on Echoes of Birmingham, King's Legacy in Today's Minnesota. It's my distinct pleasure now to introduce our 3 panelists who will bring different perspectives to our discussion. Two of our panelists, I think, are very well known to this audience, and at their direction, I've promised to keep the introduction to a sentence or so. So first, we have Professor Mark Kappelhoff, a member of the law school faculty, who spent much of his career at the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and in his most recent stint there, on loan, I'm proud to say, from the law school, he handled the department's police misconduct investigations, including, most prominently, the investigation and report on the events in Ferguson. We also have Justice Alan Page, who is doubly famous, first for his role as one of the greatest defensive players ever to play in the National Football League, and more recently, and more pertinently for our purposes, his role as one of the finest Supreme Court justices in the state of Minnesota. And also joining us, and we're very fortunate to have her here, is Dr. Tracy Kazee. She's a retired 25-year veteran of the Denver Police Department, and also the co-founder and director of research partnerships for the Center for Policing Equity at the University of California in Los Angeles. And in 2014, she was chosen to direct the Justice Department's National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice, which is one of the nation's leading authorities on issues at the intersection of race and policing. So please join me in welcoming our panelists, and then we will turn it over to Professor Kappelhoff.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. And thank all of you for coming out today, and welcome back to school. I know it's probably a harsh reality set in this morning when you got up, but welcome back to school. I just want to pick up on where Dean Whitman was talking about the letter from Birmingham jail, really a seminal moment in our nation's history when it comes to civil rights. And the passage that Dean Whitman referenced is really one of my favorite passages in the letter. Much of it it's incredibly powerful. But there's another part to it that I think resonates with me, and I think it resonates right now in the country. It's very relevant. And the first phrase, as Dean Whitman mentioned, is injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and I think many people are familiar with that. It's the next two sentences, in my mind, that also are critically important, and that is, he goes on to say, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects us all indirectly. And I think that's particularly pertinent today in our country as we have this national conversation about race, policing, and community trust, something I've spent a lot of time in my career working on. And what is interesting is how this conversation and the events that launched this conversation impacts all of us. All of us are paying attention today, I think, like we never have. And I think that speaks to the notion of we are, in fact, in an inescapable network of mutuality. And really how we address it ties us in a single garment of destiny. I think that's where, for me, Dr. King's letter resonates. And the conversation began not at the time of Michael Brown's shooting, but well before that. But more recently, it was the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson that caused our country to enter into this very, very important conversation. And that conversation has continued. It continued with the familiar names that you all probably know: Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray, Eric Garner, Laquan McDonald, and here locally, Jamar Clark. And those incidents have resonated in our country and caused this conversation to be more robust than ever before. All of us tied together in this conversation. And events like those I've mentioned don't occur in isolation, and this conversation isn't new that we're having in our country. The issues of police community trust are not confined to any one city, one region, one state, in some ways not even one country. But the problem is part of much broader social, economic, and the historical issues we all face and how we all must address together. So I mentioned these issues aren't new. We saw similar issues in the 60s in Watts. We saw them after the Rodney King verdict in Los Angeles in the 90s. And we see them again today. We're having a similar conversation. But I think today what's different is people are paying attention like never before. Families are having these conversations around dinner tables. Communities are having rigorous debate and conversation. There are protests, there are demonstrations, and people are standing up and they're saying, we want change. And we've seen it here in Minneapolis, and I've seen it around the country in Ferguson and in Baltimore and the many other cities I traveled to when I worked at the Department of Justice and Civil Rights Division working on policing matters and hate crime issues. And I had conversations with family members who lost loved ones. I had conversations with community members, police officers, and there was this common thread, and there was a common tension that we tried to address in these conversations in these communities. And what I came away with was, I think we have an opportunity in our country today to really take on these challenges that we've been faced with. A real unique opportunity together, as Dr. King talks about, to address these problems, because we are, in fact, tied in one single garment of destiny. And if we don't address these issues, if we don't take on these issues at this time, I am concerned about what it means for our future generations. So I think we have a unique opportunity, and that's why that phrase, those lines in Dr. King's letter not only resonated back in the 60s, but I think they tie us to that history today.
Dr. Kazee?
Well, I think for me, I had to think about this. So I've read the letter on several occasions, and it's always nice to go back and to refresh, to hear Dr. King's words. But there's themes throughout the letter for me that, in my work with not just law enforcement, but with community, ring very, very true. And I don't necessarily think that for some communities this constitutes a national moment more so than a historical exhaustion and a here we go again. And so I think that for me, and for the work that we're doing with the national initiative, this space of exhaustion that King points to and trying to get people to mediate and negotiate and having to turn to certain means that make people feel uncomfortable are still very real tactics that were used then and are occurring certainly now and have been experienced here in Minneapolis. But when we talk about law enforcement, and in the section, it's really towards the end when King makes reference to everyone saying what a great job law enforcement did during their demonstration and how they were commended, really speaks to this ongoing notion of how people perceive and are experiencing policing. And so that is one of the spaces in which not just the national moment, if that's what you want to call it, is occurring, but also that is a space of national exhaustion for folks of color and communities of color who are really taking these hysterical narratives and are living them over and over again, and the trauma that goes along with it. The interesting part about in that space of race and policing is being able to have very honest, open, authentic conversations around what we believe good policing is. What does it look like? What does a good officer look like? How does a good officer behave? So these are still questions that are out there that are very resonant in this letter about how you are rewarding certain behaviors and how those behaviors are being experienced by another portion of the community. There's also this theme of unconscious behavior or implicit bias and explicit bias. For most law enforcement today, these terms are very new. I mean, it's something you certainly didn't hear in the academy. It's something now that you're beginning to hear in the academy along with procedural justice. And really being able to wrap your minds around what does that mean? What does the notion of implicit bias mean? Explicit, I think we all get it, right? And we know it when we see it typically, hopefully. But this notion of unconscious bias and being aware of the way that you're behaving and being aware of the impact your stereotypical associations about one community and how they influence your behavior and really can influence your actions that you take that sometimes can end in deadly consequences. That's a space that's very new for law enforcement, and that's a space that they are struggling to deal with. And I think that there is sort of this underlying theme that King is, I don't think at the time really, may or may not know, I certainly can't speak for him in that space, but it's not just about unconscious bias, procedural justice, the way communities are being policed, but also how do we educate law enforcement on their roles in community and being a part of community? And how do we help them understand why we have gotten back to this space? So I don't want to say that we've ever left it. It's looked different. It's been improved upon in some areas. But there is this internal law enforcement conversation that when you speak to police officers on the ground, they don't know how we got here. And that in itself is problematic. And really not being able to understand history and how history is in some cases repeating itself, but in some cases history is being relived. And so we are doing a lot of work around how do we do that. And I think that that's probably a piece in the letter when I was thinking about this over the last couple of days that really was not present. It may have been at the time, but I just don't think there was enough space between the movement itself and trying to analyze what law enforcement is doing. But I think King did always a really good job of identifying responses to their ability to make change. So I think for me, in that law enforcement context, that's what the letter sort of does for me.
I would begin by noting that in 1963, when the letter was written, I was 18 years old. And growing up as a child of the 50s in a black neighborhood in Canton, Ohio, there was a great deal of distrust of law enforcement. I look at Dr. King's letter and I see it's interesting, a comprehensive sort of view of what the movement was about. He looked at it as a whole, not just, he went through the individual parts, but he looked at it as a whole. And I think one of the lessons to be learned today is that in trying to address the issues that we are concerned about today, the police abuse, whatever else it may happen to be, is we have to take a comprehensive approach. It's not enough to simply identify one piece of the problem and complain about it and do nothing more. And I would note that in 1963, when the letter was written, and the progress that has been made since then, and the progress that had been made up to that point, lawyers had played a really key and important role in that. I mean, from the time 1896 of Plessy, and certainly before that, but between Plessy and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, lawyers did a lot of work in a comprehensive manner. It wasn't piecemeal. I mean, when you think about the work of Thurgood Marshall, Constance Baker Motley, they did an incredible job on a national level of piecing it all together and using what they did in one place to make progress in another. And one of the things that I've sort of, when I look back, it seems that we've sort of lost that. We've lost an understanding that we have to sort of have a broad effort and not just bits and pieces here and there.
Great. Well, I should have said this at the outset, but we really envisioned this as a dialogue with all of you. So what we want to do is throw it open to questions. I can certainly ask questions of the panelists myself, but we'd prefer it if you would do it. We have a couple of people who have microphones, and I see one hand up here, so that we need a microphone down in front, right over here. And we're just going to open it for a conversation among the panelists and with the audience in response to your questions. We're just trying to save some money. Batteries are expensive. Yes.
About some of the intersectionalities of race and gender and policing and the women who are not being seen. And in particular, she did something that was incredibly powerful and striking, which is in a group of people who all work, it was a full ballroom of people who all work on civil rights. She started to name names of women who had been killed by the police and asked people to put their hand down as soon as they didn't know someone's name. And it didn't take very many names before the whole room had their hands down, right? And I was thinking about sort of this complexity of intersectionality, right? I've done a lot of work over the years on environmental justice, which tends to be the stepchild of both the environmental and civil rights movement, right? And thinking about some of the sort of inflammatory statements Trump makes where, so on the one hand, things can be ignored or not dealt with correctly because of their intersectionality. On the other hand, sometimes intersectionality gets used as a device to try to get away with saying things that are actually racist, right? So national security, terrorism, et cetera, and sort of saying really racist things about Muslims. It's not exactly racist, it's complicated, right? But that's the thing, things get complicated at the intersections. And so, and that tends to be where both law and society get less good at sort of working things out. So I was curious, sort of your perspective on intersectionality. And then related to this question about intersectionality, I think I've always felt like law is pretty good at getting at de jure discrimination. But the de facto discrimination has always been more of a problem for law, whether you think about any sector. I've been thinking about it a lot because the Oscar nominations just came out, right?
Absolutely.
And there's been, again, no people of color nominated for Best Actor. And Straight Outta Compton doesn't get nominated when Mad Max does, right? And so, and Straight Outta Compton, of course, is a movie about some of the
That's
things
right. That's
sort of very current.
That's right.
And so, and I think about the actor who said that it's easier for an African American man to be elected president than, run a major Hollywood studio. And
So we should probably let the panelists tackle. There's a lot there.
So I was curious also sort of how to deal not only with intersectionality, but the places where law sort of doesn't get at those interstices.
Well, I'll start with the intersectionality piece. And so bravo for mentioning that and understanding. The intersectionality piece in law enforcement is still a very difficult space, right? Because, as you so aptly described, it is the uncharted territory, and we don't know what to say, and we don't know what to do, and we don't know what's appropriate. But it also brings with it a different level of conversation, right? And sometimes in those intersections, it gets very uncomfortable to have to do that. And we see that with, now more so, with the transgender community in law enforcement, right? So those intersections are even more difficult. But I think that as we move forward, and, as very much the panelists are saying, these are These are whole areas. You've just identified another space in which there hasn't been much discussion. There has just been a sort of tacit acknowledgement of it, but there really hasn't been a digging down into what do we do. And a lot of folks don't know what to do, and that's part of the problem, right? How do we begin to address those specific issues? And I think that in having, really authentic conversations with Kimberly Crenshaw's and the folks that are experts in those areas and the community at the table when we are trying to determine the best way to shape policy, the interactions with community. How do we really do that in a way that is sensitive to that space and that it is a place that does not go back and re-injure and to re-traumatize? And these are, certainly concepts and discussions that are still really new for law enforcement. Even the notion of trauma is new. So I hear you. I don't know, folks are boycotting the Oscars now, right, because of that. But then there'll be, activists on the ground and say, that's not going to do us any good, right? There'll be 4 or 5 people missing, but it speaks to the broader structure that if I am missing, I'm going to be missing out on some jobs. And we don't deal with that reality, so.
Let me touch on your I think, great question about the laws, the civil rights laws, and how do you get to this discrimination? I had the honor and privilege to enforce laws that were passed in the 60s, the 65 Voting Rights Act, 68 Hate Crime Statute, Fair Housing Act, and I firmly believe those laws and those who fought and died to have those laws enacted changed our country for the better immensely. It was a sea change. We've made tremendous progress. We have many, many miles to travel, but they were instrumental in changing the way our country operates. And it was done through lawyers, it was done through lawsuits, and tenacity, frankly. And my great fear today is those laws are under assault. We saw a couple of years ago where the Supreme Court struck down part of the Voting Rights Act. Okay, working in the Civil Rights Division at that time, and seeing the Voting Rights Act struck down, knowing full well there's discrimination out there at the ballot box, the franchise, really what makes our country different than many other countries. To me, that's a travesty. There is discrimination. We know it exists. We've seen it. I saw it in the Civil Rights Division. So you see those laws being struck down by the Supreme Court saying, apparently, the law works so well we don't need it anymore. Okay, I don't understand that thinking. Recently, the Supreme Court has looked at the issue of disparate impact in the Fair Housing Act. Myron Orfield's worked on that his entire life. Vice President Mondale got the law enacted. Okay, disparate impact is the way we proved cases, proved violations of the Fair Housing Act. That is hanging by a thread. It was a 5-4 decision, and you change one justice, and we no longer will have the theory of disparate impact in the Fair Housing Act, and who knows where else that's going to travel. So that is my great concern, is there's almost a parallel universe happening where we go out into the community. Tracy and I have had these conversations where communities of color feel as if the system is not treating them fairly, and they have tangible examples of where that isn't occurring. Criminal justice system, economic empowerment. And then you have a court system that's saying, well, apparently we've solved these problems of discrimination and we don't need these laws that have changed our country. That's troubling to me, and those are conversations I think our country needs to continue to have.
You talk about disparate impact. When I joined the court in 1993, we issued our report on racial bias in our judicial system. Focused a great deal on the criminal justice system, but beyond the criminal justice system. With respect to the criminal justice system, people of color were grossly overrepresented. Grossly overrepresented. It seems to me, given that overrepresentation, we shouldn't be, and both in terms of, I should note, both in terms of people who were being arrested, who were being charged, who were being convicted, given longer sentences, and then ending up in prison, given the over-representation on the front end, the over-policing, if you will, we should not be surprised, I don't think, that in our communities of color, that there is a disparity in those who are ending up dead as a result of police misconduct. Just based on the numbers, there's going to be a disparity. And I'm not sure, and I should note that we haven't changed those numbers in terms of disparity very much over the last 23 years. And with a lot of effort by a lot of smart people working very hard to do it. And I make the point I don't have an answer.
There's a couple of students with questions.
My name's Devin Driscoll. I'm a 1L. And this is for Justice Page. On your point about the lack of a broad consensus on steps to take forward and address the challenges, it seems like right now there's both, in the legal community and the broader community, a lot of conflicting theories of change about how we can actually address this problem. And those communities, those theories of change seem to be focused on beating up each other, whose theory of change is better, versus trying to come together for some broad consensus. Do you sense that that's what's keeping us from having a broad consensus, and what do you think we can do to try to move more towards having some sort of broad consensus about moving forward?
Well, certainly in the 1960s, there was a debate amongst various groups about which approach was better. Should we follow Dr. King and be nonviolent? The Black Power movement, should we take to the streets? But all of that is at some level, those discussions are important, but the real question is sitting down and figuring out where you want to get to, and then plotting a path to get there. If anarchy is what you're after, then violence in the streets works. If you want to change the law, it seems to me that there are a whole host of tools that you can use to do that. But I think you have to be prepared and willing to use all of them, not just some of them.
And I think the woman right behind, and then there's behind her as well. And if I'm not seeing people on this side, wave at me. Oops.
Hi, good morning. I'm Tandi. I'm a lawyer from South Africa. I wanted to find out about two questions. First one being whether or not you think there's room for constitutional reform, because as a lawyer from South Africa, being governed by a constitution that doesn't allow for bias in the judiciary, I don't know if you can still use the law in the context of the US to actually overcome the structural inequalities that are currently being experienced. And then secondly, I wanted to find out about the use of body cameras. Michelle Alexander, who's the author of The New Jim Crow, recently criticized the use of body cameras as another means of surveillance in communities of color, rather than actually aiding communities of color in cases against police brutality. So I just wanted to find out about your perspectives on those issues. Thanks.
Let me start with body cameras.
No,
go ahead.
I probably shouldn't.
You should.
Get into this whole body camera discussion, but body cameras are good for showing you what happened. They don't change anybody's conduct necessarily. Maybe they discourage some conduct, maybe they don't. In the end, it's nice to have that evidence, but they're just a small piece of the answer, not a big piece.
What you said, right? Exactly. I think that what we often find happening when we talk about body cameras, and not to get too bogged down on it, is that if we remember the progression of any type of police tactic that has changed, right? There was tremendous resistance from law enforcement to use body cameras at first in the United States, and then it was the narrative was, you know, well, this can only help us sort of prove our case. And then, you know, so there's this change of let's get everybody, and the community says this too, give everybody body cameras, that will tell you what really, really happened. And so we have a tendency to sort of fall on, I'm just sort of echoing what, you know, the judge said, fall on one thing, thinking that's going to be the magic pill that's going to make all of this okay, right? There's still a lot of civil liberty issues that have not been worked out with cameras, right? And the police departments are struggling with this because, you know, how do you, when you're doing an interaction and that person is young, you know, you don't have permission to talk to them, they're on camera. When do you turn them on? When do you turn them off? You know, how often are they running? When do you get to review the tape? So all of those things have yet to really be challenged in court. And then there's a bigger concern that the community is sort of wrapping themselves around the body cameras is going to be able to tell us, and it only tells you one side of the story. And that's if the technology was working the way in which it's supposed to be working, and if it was turned on when it was supposed to be turned on. So I think that I go back again to it's much deeper than that. It's much deeper than laying on an additional piece of technology tool with these issues that are on the ground with law enforcement.
There's a student in the middle here.
Hello. Oh, okay. I'm Mernush Karimiandu. I'm a 2L student. I'm from Iran. I wanted to ask a question. It's a general question to the panel, but especially for you, Justice Page. You mentioned lawyers did a comprehensive job for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You know about the current Islamophobia. Some of the presidential candidates, they are, I can say shamelessly, advocates for desegregating Muslims. So believe it or not, they started the discourse in the society. So I'm not sure, I'm a 2L student still, but I'm not sure that the current Civil Rights Act can, approach this problem. This ongoing new fascism or a kind of, I can say, white supremacy or what they want to apply, white supremacy. So how lawyers can approach this ongoing problem and, like the lawyers did for the rights of the Afro-Americans? Thanks.
Very difficult question, because at some level, it runs smack into the middle of the First Amendment, amongst other things. And that somebody exercises their right to say offensive, to use offensive language, even if they're running for president, courting those votes. They probably get to do that under our system, under our Constitution. I think ultimately the answer to that is, and it gets to taking this back to the letter, Dr. King's letter, is what do good people do? Do we sit on our hands and do nothing? Or do we stand up to that speech with more powerful speech? And that's one of the dangers, and I think Dr. King says it well. It's not really what the bad people are doing. It's what the good people are not doing.
There's a hand over here.
My name's Greg. I'm a third year. So my question for the panel is, what role do kind of young white people, young white men play in this? So you mentioned, the issue of how do we educate police on their role in the community, and it's not what do good people do. So, for example, for the Black Lives Matter movement in the Twin Cities, I'd say on my social media, I'm friends with mostly young, white millennials. Everyone was pro Black Lives Matter in their ends, but once we shut down the trains for the holidays, I saw on my media is like, I was for the movement, but now I disagree with the means that we're accomplishing that with the movement. And I think a lot of young, so I speak for white people, feel helpless. And there's kind of this disconnect, I think, when the discussions I have with people who look like me versus people who are black and involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, who, you see a white guy go to the Black Lives Matter protest, and then they disagree with the means, and they want to take a leadership role. So there's kind of this disconnect with, what role do people play, the majority, so to speak. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts on, what do the good people do, or, maybe well-intentioned, if we kind of feel helpless.
So, it didn't get really quiet up here, but because this is a question that young people ask all of the time, specifically on young white males, young females, and for my experience, I can't speak to the other young folks in the room, and everybody's young in here to me, is social media is one thing, but showing up and speaking up is something totally different. And making your voice heard is, and I know that is sort of a generational difference, right? There's a lot of communication going on from a social media aspect, which is really good. I'm not saying that that's not a bad way to go, but sometimes your physical presence and opening up when you are having those uncomfortable conversations with your folks that look like you and intervening and stopping those conversations and trying to engage and correct the narratives that are happening. And then sometimes when we talk about, the Black Lives Matter, and I probably think there's probably some of you that may have been there, you also have to challenge your notion of showing up and taking over because you don't think things are running the way you think they should run, right? Sometimes your physical presence is enough, right? And if my understanding of how BLM is working, it's not really the traditional structure, hierarchical structure, right? It is very much a community and very much a shared notion of how we should think about moving forward. And sometimes it's challenging ourselves in the way in which we were raised and framed, the right way we would do this, right? And that's a very difficult thing to do, is to say, well, I would do it like this, and I'm good with you until you cross the line, right? So that's like, to me, that's a sometimey friend, right? And what is it? I think a friend always told me, love hurts sometimes, right? So you love this person, good, bad, and indifferent. You certainly voice the fact that we don't like the means, but it doesn't mean you cut your belief in what they're doing off, right? You certainly can articulate that. And I'll challenge some of the other, young folks of color in here, just to also voice. But, sometimes your presence is enough, and sometimes your voice is enough, and sometimes you find that space where you're not comfortable. That's not good for me, but this might be. But I think for me and what I've seen, nationally and listening and watching, sometimes it's just speaking up. That is very difficult for a lot of folks, just uttering the words, this is wrong. It means a lot. It makes you simple, to other folks, but even for you, in your own culture, in your own community, has a lot of backlash and connotation to it as well, right? So we know that those aren't, stances or beliefs that you are weighing lightly when you make the decision to say something. So there's recognition around that. But I would say, have the conversations, ask, how would you like me to be involved in this or not? Or what can I do to assist you in this? So sort of not going into the notion that because it doesn't work the parochial way in which I was raised and how power should be moving forward, and I'm an attorney and this is the way we do things, you got to let things go. And it's difficult. It's difficult. We live in structure. But I think, for me, just the initial raise your voice, put name and face to what's going on today. And then the rest of it will come. Have the conversations. Ask. So I'll stop there. I can't speak for everybody. I'm old, so as far as I go.
No one could ever speak.
all relative.
That's right. I know it's true.
You don't dare
That's
speak
where I go.
for Tracy at all.
So
I would
saying.
just add that don't be afraid, and it sounds like you're doing it, is examine your position or your viewpoint.
Absolutely.
Look inside. I spend a lot of time, worked in the Civil Rights Division. I was always examining my views on things and seeing the world a little differently. And don't be afraid to examine your viewpoint. And maybe your viewpoint is wrong. Maybe it's right. Maybe you're uncomfortable with it. It's unclear. But the other part of it, examine your own point of view, we all have to find a way to be uncomfortable and have uncomfortable conversations. And that is particularly in the area of race. We don't do that enough. And it's hard. It is hard. And I've had hard conversations. I think all of you have had these hard conversations. And we have to be willing to have those conversations. Because I think if we don't, we end up standing in place. Mm-hmm. We don't take a moment to examine someone else's point of view or examine our own point of view. And what we do is we go off into the corners, right? It's easy. It's safe, right? Just go off in the corner. I don't want to have that conversation. Oh, that's ooky. That's hard to deal with. It's messy. There's not an easy right or wrong answer to many of these questions. And I think we oftentimes are all too afraid to have those conversations. But I believe those are exactly the conversations we need to have because it's what's going to move us all forward to a different place.
Yeah. And I think one last thing, because I'm thinking about that, because that was a brave question for you to ask, first of all. But I think that for me, it's not just your voice, but acknowledge that the experiences that are happening around you are happening, right? Just because you're not going through it and you've never seen it or never experienced it, you have to find a way to, as you say, self-reflect and say, I know I've never been stopped just walking home, or I've never been denied service at a counter or followed around in a mall. You don't know what that feels like. But sometimes just the acknowledgement that you are not living in the same spaces that some part of the community is living in. You have to acknowledge that, and you have to accept it. And I know that leads us into certain conversations about, not just necessarily white supremacy, but about privilege. I mean, that is, the elephant in the room in a lot of spaces, is that you get to walk around and operate in a world and a space that others don't enjoy. And it doesn't mean that, everybody is living in misery. But there is a common shared experience out there that is very alive and very real and very historical. And I think that that's sort of the beginning steps. And how you share that and help other folks sort of draw that out is going to be key.
Yeah, someone over here.
Yeah, so my name's Seth Stawilla. I'm a 1L student. And I just, I know we've been talking about it somewhat, but I have a question about media and how that all plays into, kind of this generational fight that span generations that we're facing today. And particularly, this room is, not reflective of America. America's not all dominantly lawyers. We're not all this well educated. Right. And, these folks, with this conversation we're having, we're struggling to recognize and understand this issue. And it's all too easy for middle class America, or middle America, and the mass, the rest of it to turn a blind eye to this. And when they see, stories like Greg was talking about on how, folks shutting down freeways and folks shutting down the airport to say, oh, they're hooligans, oh, they're protesting, this isn't, I don't want to do this, I don't feel comfortable with this, I'm going to turn a blind eye to this. How does that play into this narrative? Because, I'm tempted to look at the successes that the civil rights movement had, and particularly, with MLK, what I attribute a large portion of the success in forcing the hand of President Johnson to move forward political change was seeing citizens and fellow Americans being beaten in the streets of, Selma, Alabama with, batons and, being hosed in Birmingham. And so I guess how does that fit into this narrative? Particularly, it's a PR war. In a large sense it is. In my opinion at least.
I don't want to dominate the conversation.
You're right. You're right. Right. It's on. In the '60s, it was on TV too. But remember, things didn't change in the '60s until, frankly, some very courageous reporters actually covered some of the things that were happening. The Selma incident was, obviously a seminal moment because of the brutality, and that's the history that Dr. Kassy was talking about. That history of police officers carrying out that type of brutality on a bridge for people who were simply protesting to not vote. Remember, they were protesting the right to register to vote. Big difference. So that had a sea change when the rest of frankly, the world got to watch. That's where, the saying, the whole world's watching, in fact, they were. And you're right, the media plays a very important role, and that's part of the process, right, of changing minds, changing hearts, and changing viewpoints. And I think bringing that into the living rooms in our nation, it's an important thing for people to see that and have the conversation, for crying out loud. Let's have the conversation. We're having it here today. That's important, and we need to have it across the country. And if the media helps bring it out into the open where we can have the conversation, all the better.
It's true that having body cameras, back to that, will give you a visual that people will, I think, have a difficult time turning away from, as they could not turn away from what happened on the Edmund Pettus Bridge or what happened in Birmingham with the police dogs. But that being said, the sort of the unwillingness to look at what's going on, the protests, sort of without the other side of it, makes it understandable why people want to turn away, why they become disinterested. But when you can connect and how we do that when you don't have when you can't see it happening, how you connect microphone.
It seems to be
On and off. How you connect the demonstration with the cause, I think, is critical. And indeed, one of the things that I think they were very good at doing in the 50s and 60s, when there was when the law at issue was voting, they would show up at the polling place to try to register. You can see the connection. When the law was lunch counters, you can see the connection between sitting in at the lunch counter and the protest. Sometimes it's not so easy to see the connection between police violence here, police abuse here, and shutting down the traffic in a freeway. That gets to be a very complicated issue, I think. I think it's important for those who are inclined to act, and I think action is required of all of us. For those inclined to act, we have to act in ways that help those who we're trying to influence understand what the real problem is.
So we are unfortunately nearing the end of our time. My microphone is going also. We're nearing the end of our time, and I promised Dean Keyes an opportunity to give us some closing remarks and a few announcements. So, Dean Keyes.
First of all, I want to say thank you to our panelists for being with us today, and for the members of our diversity committee, which includes students, faculty, and staff, and for lots of people who are in this room and not in this room who've come forward and said the law school needs to be having more of these discussions. And this is just the starting point. This is just a starting point. Dr. King talks in his letter about the fact that there is this concern about the methods being used, criticizing direct action, and that he wished that the clergymen who were criticizing him would actually bring as much attention and focus to the underlying conditions that gave rise to the protests. And I think we have so much that is happening at the law school, whether it is engaging with clients in the clinics, dealing with some really tough issues. Professor Orfield's Metropolitan Opportunity Study that is showing the resegregation patterns in housing and schooling, et cetera. And so many other issues that could and have come up in classes, even those that aren't typically considered, those where we'd be talking about equity issues. These kinds of issues come up. I know that it's of great interest to the faculty as well as our students and staff. And so back to this question of what can we do? I want to give a huge thank you to Nubia Esparza. As you're walking out today, if you didn't already get a chance to pick one up, there's a fantastic handout that includes events that are coming up, as well as opportunities to learn more, to read more, to examine what you can and want to do. I also want to thank our law council because they have pulled together, I believe, close to 150 people from the law school community to get out in our community this Saturday at the MLK Raise the Bar Day of Service. I know many people in this room are signed up. I am. My family's going to be going. But it means getting out of our comfort levels and having opportunities to figure out what biases we're living with, how is that playing out, and getting out of our own context so that we can figure out from the perspective of people who are most impacted by it, what can we do, how can we help, whether that's raising a question in class or being a student organization leader and sponsoring more discussions. There's lots of goodwill in the room and at the law school and a lot that we can all do. So thank you to everyone for taking part today. Thank you, Dean Whitman, for his great leadership on this. And we hope the conversations and the action continue. Thank you.
Thank you.